Hello folks, this video is going to be a short troubleshooting tip for a materials problem we see from time to time. So here's the issue. When initiating the render process, Podium normally exports all the textures in the model and saves them in a temporary directory. Now, most models have a couple dozen textures at most, and this process normally finishes pretty quickly. However, if you notice Podium getting stuck during the exporting materials stage, or worse, if Podium is crashing during the exporting materials stage, then there's a problem. So I've got this simple kitchen model open, and if I just come up here and click the render button, we're going to see the process starts as it usually would. The bar is progressing, then it stops, and Sketchup crashes. Now I've got a second instance of that model opened so we can continue with the video, but you saw it was in the middle of the exporting materials process, and then Sketchup crashed. Now, it doesn't always happen that abruptly. Sometimes in a more complicated model, the exporting materials process will go on for 10 or 20 seconds, and then the bar will suddenly stop, the cursor might start spinning for a while, and then it'll either stall out, or Podium will crash and SketchUp will crash, as we saw in the previous example. So we call this material fragmentation, and it occurs with triangulated meshes, or models that are imported from 3D Warehouse or other third-party modeling applications like Maya, Blender, 3ds Max, etc. Now, in most circumstances, it's perfectly fine to use a model that was created in Maya, Blender, or outside of SketchUp, as long as they're set up correctly. What happens with this issue is that these imported models are sometimes UV texture mapped in a way that Podium can't interpret correctly. So, when you use the paint bucket to apply a material to surfaces that were created in SketchUp, the material repeats or tiles across the surface. So even if a material is painted across an edge boundary, it's still recognized as a single material. SketchUp and Podium both see this marble countertop as a single material. There's continuity across the faces. With triangulated meshes that were created outside of SketchUp, there can be problems if the object wasn't correctly UV mapped. So in these problem cases, instead of a single material painted across an entire model, every single face is assigned a unique material and texture. So what happens is when you go to render, instead of exporting and saving 10 or 20 texture files, Podium has to process hundreds or even thousands of individual faces and save each one of those as a separate JPEG image in a temporary folder. So this is what takes so long, and in more extreme cases, this is what can cause the exporter to crash or fail. Alright, so let's say you have a model that's getting stuck on exporting materials. Now we know the probable cause, but we don't know which object in the model is causing the problem. Well, thankfully, there's an easy way to find out. All we have to do is export the model from SketchUp using Collada DAE as the export format. SketchUp will save the scene file, and will also save a folder containing all the textures in the model. So let me show you what the fragmentation problem looks like and how to identify it. I'm going to come back into SketchUp, go to File, Export, 3D Model, and I'm just going to find the folder that I was using for this. Okay, so under Save as Type, we want to make sure Collada DAE is selected. Give it a unique file name, and then under Options, just make sure Export Texture Maps is selected. I'm going to click OK, click Export, and that process is going to start. Now, if there's fragmentation present, this export process will take longer than it normally should. So, as you can see, it's sort of choked up here at 75%. So let me pause the video while it finishes, and then we'll take a look in the textures folder. Okay, so the exporter finished. We've got our DAE scene file, and then this is the folder with all the texture images. And if I click into it, it's immediately apparent that there's a problem. This isn't the way it's supposed to look. So if I go down to the bottom here, we can see textures that are recognizable as textures. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, most models should contain a fairly low number of textures, anything between, 10, 20, a few dozen, but not hundreds or thousands. And if you look at one of them, it should be relatively clear what you're looking at. So this is obviously the backsplash in the kitchen. This is the marble countertop. These are the fruits from this fruit bowl. But if I scroll up, we're seeing thousands of fragmented JPEG images labeled copper 6640, 4142. And as I said before, When this fragmentation problem appears, every single face on an object on a triangulated mesh is being exported as a separate texture. So to find and solve the problem, I just need to go back to the Sketchup model and figure out which object is using this copper material. And this is a simple model, so it's not going to be hard to find, right? So if I zoom out, you can probably already guess that it's the light fixture causing problems in this model. And I can confirm this by opening the materials palette, grabbing the eyedropper, and then color picking this material. And there it is, copper. But instead of being processed as a single material, it's being split up into thousands of separate texture images. Okay, so in the SketchUp viewport, everything looks perfectly fine. I can zoom all the way in, and nothing really looks obviously wrong about this. However, if I go to View, Hidden Geometry, we can see how dense this mesh is, and that's a pretty good clue that this probably isn't native SketchUp geometry and must have been imported with incorrect UV maps. All right, so we've identified the source of the problem. Now, how do we fix it? Well, the first option is to simply delete the light fixture and replace it with something else. It's not a great solution, but maybe it might be possible to look through Podium browser and find something similar and just get rid of the problematic model altogether. A second option would be to come in here into the material settings, get that copper material back up. And since this isn't a super visible texture anyway, I could just remove the texture from the material. So if I unclick Use Texture Image, now it's just a solid colored material. And solid colored materials don't need to save any temporary JPEG files. So this, having removed that texture file, should now work. The last option is to retexture the surface using a SketchUp plugin that supports UV mapping. Now, this is a bit more difficult, and I think it's going to be outside the scope of this short tutorial, but I will point you in the direction of a few plugins that can help with it. Then you can do your own research from there. So the first option is called Wrapper, which is probably the most robust and feature-rich UV mapping plugin for SketchUp. I've used the trial briefly, and it is very good. They're highly advanced UV tools, but it does cost $60. A free option is called Through Paint, and it's part of the Frito Tools toolset by Frito6. He's a pretty well-known SketchUp developer and packages this Frito Tools bundle, which I already have installed. If I click that, it just launches this little tool set with several utility plugins, and the one that's useful for painting UV maps is called Through Paint. But I haven't really used it, so I'm not comfortable doing a demonstration on it right now. Maybe in the future. The other option is called Sketch UV, which I also haven't used. But Sketch UV by Mindsight Studios, UV mapping tools, spherical, cylindrical, planar, tube, box, quad maps. So several different UV mapping options to help you fix a problematic model. Okay, I think I'm gonna stop the video right there. That should help you figure out at least how to identify material fragmentation in a model that's crashing or getting hung up on the exporting materials phase. So again, even if you don't want to retexture the surface, you can always either remove the model or simply remove the texture. So I hope that helps you guys. There's a chance I'll expand on it in the future with a little bit more info on the Through Paint plugin. But for now, I'm going to call it finished, and I'll see you all in the next one.